Hello there, welcome back to Talking Europe on France 24. Now, while Europe's migration crisis continues to preoccupy the public and our politicians, there's another kind of migration, a kind of forced migration that we're talking about a lot less. It is human trafficking. Its victims are people forced to travel into the EU for sexual exploitation, organ trafficking, or for forced labour, among other motives. Recent figures indicate that there may be as many as 16,000 victims of human trafficking in the EU each year. There have been new moves recently to coordinate the European response to it. We're going to be discussing all of this with our guest today. I'm very pleased to welcome Myria Vassiliadou, who's the EU's anti-trafficking coordinator. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, first question then. I'd like to talk about the distinction between human trafficking and people smuggling. These are two things that we can often confuse. We actually have a graphic as well to help us from the United Nations.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the question. Indeed, it's something that is confusing to the public and the media and sometimes even decision makers. When we talk about trafficking human beings, we're essentially talking about people being bought and sold for the purpose of their exploitation. When we talk about, and a victim of trafficking doesn't need to cross a border. You could be you could be in France as a French citizen and being trafficked, whereas smuggling means that you have to cross a border. Also, when you're smuggled, basically, it's a crime against the government. Mm-hmm. Trafficking is a crime against the individual, and it's also against our human rights. It's a human rights violation. And if you're trafficked, you don't consent to being trafficked. When you're smuggled, you basically want to irregularly enter another country, and you consent to that movement. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of differences there.
And in terms of the reasons why people are trafficked, or rather the motives, I should say, as this is, as you say, a crime?
Well, certainly the most important thing to remember is that people don't want to be trafficked. They don't want to be bought and sold, and they don't want to be exploited. Sometimes people in search of a better future, employment, other opportunities, fake job advertisements, they apply for jobs. They even know that they may be working without documents or illegally and so on. But what they don't know is that they will become victims of traffickers who take away their documents, who take away their payment, who often make sure that they threaten them one way or another. And certainly these people are in a situation where they cannot escape. That's why we call them trafficked.
And I know that the places that people end up are probably very varied, and the types of things that happen to these people. But can you just give us some of the major sort of groups of crimes that happen to these people?
Well, there's many forms of exploitation, but the most widespread form is trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation. In fact, about 2/3 of the victims in Europe are victims of sexual exploitation. But then there's people who are trafficked for labor exploitation. There's people who are forced to engage in criminal activities. There's people who are forced to beg. There's people who are forced to get married to third country nationals.
In order that the third country national can get an EU passport?
Yes, but it doesn't mean that it's with the consent of the person marrying them. Mm-hmm. So there's many different forms, and some of them are more brutal than others, but certainly it's all about exploitation. The most important thing we should remember is that 2/3 of the victims are actually, that we find in Europe, are EU nationals. Mm-hmm. So that also answers to what's the difference between smuggling and trafficking. We cannot say that everybody who is smuggled is a victim of trafficking.
That's an interesting statistic. 2/3 of the victims in the EU, actually EU nationals. Now, the EU is known as being a place where human rights are very much front and centre, many more protections for citizens in Europe than in certain other parts of the world. So people watching might be thinking, considering all of this, what's to stop somebody going to the authorities to ask them for help? Surely help should be readily available.
I think the question is more, why do people become trafficked? So some people would ask the same question in reverse and say, well, is it restrictive migration policies that make people trafficked? I think what all the phenomenon of trafficking has in common in all its forms is the fact that it's not the victim that is the problem, obviously, but that is so profitable. So it has nothing to do with whether you can get a passport or whether you can move. I think we have got so used to thinking that if you're vulnerable, de facto you will be exploited. But it shouldn't really work like that. It's not healthy in our societies to think that, okay, he or she was poor, he or she was vulnerable, therefore they were exploited. Let's reverse and say, what is the root cause of that? And the root cause of that is always the money, so profits made because of the exploitation, and the fact that someone is willing to use the services of the victim. So someone has a kidney in them that was trafficked by a person who was trafficked. Someone rapes a 13-year-old who is forced to provide sexual services in the streets. Someone is forced to, I don't know, in labor exploitation because another person wants to pay less or doesn't want to pay for the services. So let's go back to why we have trafficking. It's not because of borders or no borders. It's because it's profitable and because people are willing and sometimes knowingly using the services of victims.
Well, when we talk about the money, it's estimated that human trafficking is actually the most profitable form of crime after arms trafficking. How much money are we talking about?
The UN estimates that, and of course in Europe, Europol tells us that we're estimating about 30 billion euro per year annually. But this is only for the traffickers. So we have to remember that trafficking also affects, in negative and positive ways, legal industries as well. Legal sectors engaged in legal business and also legal sectors in illegal business.
Well, there's a lot of people involved. It's obviously generating huge amounts of money for the criminals involved. How likely are our viewers, how likely are you and I to come across victims of human trafficking in our daily lives?
I think very likely, because it could be because you go and have a manicure, so the nail parlor. It could be because you go to a hotel and you're having a beautiful dinner, but you don't know who's actually making the dinner and cleaning the kitchens in the -1. So, of course, we're likely to see these people.
I mentioned earlier that Europe being a place where rights and laws are very present in our lives. One of the rights that we have as Europeans is the freedom of movement across most of the continent, particularly within the Schengen zone. There are no border controls. Yes. With 2/3 of the victims in the EU from the EU, does this mean that freedom of movement is facilitating this crime?
No, I think what facilitates the crime is always the money. You could be a victim from Nigeria or a victim from Belgium, where I'm based. You could be a victim from anywhere. What facilitates that is the fact that people are willing to exploit other people because they want cheap services and goods and products.
But if there were checks on borders, more passport checks, that kind of thing, would that be helpful? Is that part of the answer?
How would that then explain the fact that we have a lot of victims who are from third country nationals? I don't think this is the answer. I think the answer is to be found in actually asking, where is that 30 billion that Europol is talking about? Where is that money? We should be actively looking for that money. And once we cut the money flows, we stand a chance to stop the trafficking.
All right, well, let's just move on to a related point. We started off by talking about the differences between human trafficking and migrant smuggling. However, as we know, it is a documented fact that sometimes the two can go together.
Yes.
A few months ago, reporters from France 24 actually went to the UK. They met a young 16-year-old Afghan boy who'd travelled thousands of miles to flee war at home and also ended up on that journey in the notorious jungle camp in Calais. That's a place where NGOs reported that the trafficking of minors was going on. This from Julien Sauvager and Jessica Sestilli.
Hand in hand with his little cousin, a simple pleasure that means so much for Harris. Fleeing the war and terror of his homeland in Afghanistan at the end of 2015, he's finally reached his goal, London. A solo journey of over 10 months at just 16 years old. Smuggled across the Middle East, then up through Europe, Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, Greece, Slovenia, Slovakia, thousands of miles covered in just a few months.
We were walking for so long. Whenever we slowed down, they'd beat us and say, if you can't keep up with the pace, we'll abandon you right here on the spot.
Just a few weeks after his arrival in the Calais jungle, authorities announced that they would be bulldozing the camp, destroying the makeshift homes of thousands. Transfers were hurriedly arranged, among them dozens of convoys to the UK for some of the more vulnerable residents, unaccompanied minors. Harris was on the first coach out, direction London at long last. That's thanks in large part to this man, Lord Dubbs. His pressure on the UK government led to changes to the UK's Immigration Act concerning refugee minors. A move that brought their plight to the centre stage of the British public eye, bringing with it a closer focus on EU laws regarding asylum seekers.
There's a danger of criminality, prostitution, trafficking, drugs, all sorts of horrible things that could happen. And as I say, the Italian authorities apparently said 10,000 children had actually disappeared. It's a terrible thing, children disappearing in modern Europe. So the amendment seemed very, very urgent indeed. And of course the Calais situation gave it added impetus because so many of the children were in Calais.
Since the UK's vote in favour of leaving the EU, Brexit plans have become a priority, including curbing immigration numbers.
So there we go, an example of where migration can end up with human trafficking coming out of it. Myria Vassiliadou, how closely does your office work with the actual migration authorities? Because there is some mixing, isn't there?
Of course, and people who are smuggled can end up becoming trafficked. They are people who, as it was just shown, they're very vulnerable in any case. So they can become subject to exploitation. In fact, the International Organization of Migration tells us that in 2016 alone, we had an estimate of 9,000 women and girls who came from Nigeria via Libya to Italy, and they're estimated to be trafficked for the purpose of sexual exploitation. That was supposed to be in the process of migration, but it is something else. And they came here in order to be trafficked into the sex industry.
Can we say that the migration crisis has actually exacerbated the problem of human trafficking as well?
Yes, of course, we can say that, and we can say that because it has exacerbated vulnerabilities of people. And if this is all about vulnerabilities, and of course, it makes criminals and potential users, exploiters, more likely to use this vulnerability.
This is, of course, a cross-border crime, which is something that preoccupies Europe in many different areas. In the past, we have seen how sometimes European crime-fighting bodies really aren't very efficient at working together. For example, French and Belgian police absolutely struggling to talk to each other after the Bataclan attacks. Does this sort of lack of coordination hinder the fight against human trafficking as well?
Yes, there's a lot more work that needs to be done, but what I can say is that we have very good examples of member states working together. It's not always the case. There can be better exchange of information, there can be more investigation teams that are joint and so on. And for this reason, we recently launched, only last week, a cooperation amongst 10 European agencies to work together to fight human trafficking. And they involve Europol, Eurojust, so on investigation teams, the police academy, if you like, or at the European level, the Asylum Support Office, Fundamental Rights Agency. There's more, there's 10 of them. But the idea is how can we coordinate even better based on the mandate of these agencies and get them to fight this crime together.
And on the legal side as well, there are some discrepancies, aren't there? Because human trafficking is an illegal act across Europe since, I believe, 2011, when the directive was published.
Yes.
But only half of the member states, or perhaps less, have actually criminalised the act of benefiting from human trafficking. What does that actually mean to knowingly benefit from human trafficking? You know, would it be... I might check the papers of somebody at a nail salon before I let them do my manicure. I mean, it seems like a very difficult area to legislate in.
Yes, you're absolutely right. All the member states have legislated against human trafficking. Of course, is nowhere in Europe, it is everywhere illegal, of course, to engage in human trafficking. What half of our member states haven't done is criminalize those who knowingly use the services of the victims. And this is extremely problematic because sometimes when people are knowingly involved in a crime, obviously they should be criminalized. And there's no other area of crime where someone knows that they're involved and they're not criminalized. You're right, that is very hard to prove. But I remember a time when it was the same for rape, for example. And we would say, well, you cannot criminalize rape because it's so hard to prove. I don't think we want to go down that road. I think we have laws because they tell society what is acceptable and unacceptable. So if we accept that you can be knowingly involved in a crime and you're not criminalized, do we then foster a culture of impunity?
Well, in that case, is having this criminalisation of benefiting from human trafficking, is that a goal that you're looking for, and how is that going to be achieved?
Well, actually, according to EU law, all member states should at least consider criminalising those who knowingly use the services. What the European Commission is doing at the moment, it has as one of its main priorities to encourage the member states through various means to consider introducing this legislation in the member states. And I think this is the only way, because we have to hold accountable not only the criminals, but also those who are in any way knowingly involved in what we call the trafficking chain.
We've just got time for one last question. I think perhaps quite a lot of people home might be thinking, there is perhaps a business in my hometown where I see people who I sort of have a suspicion about whether they're working there of their own volition. I don't want to be over suspicious, though. What do I do about this suspicion?
In fact, that's the first thing we should be thinking. We should be suspicious, because by being suspicious, we're also careful and helping people. We should go directly to the police. We can call shelters. We can call hotlines on domestic violence. We can call hotlines on children. Anywhere you search online, you will find we also have a dedicated website where you can find all the centres working on human trafficking across the EU. And I think it would be not only advisable, but strongly encouraged that when we suspect something, we always become proactive.
All right, well, unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you so much for coming in to talk to us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Dr. Myria Vassiliadou, EU's anti-trafficking coordinator here on Talking Europe. Thank you very much for watching as well. We'll see you next time for more European news.